This is in the matter of Derrick Lee Cardello-Smith, a temporary restraining order. Do you wish to argue the motion today, sir?
Yes, Your Honor.
Sean Diddy Combs is fighting back against the man who just won a $100 million judgment against him in a sexual assault lawsuit. We're going to break down the latest legal filings from the controversial music mogul. Will he have to pay? We'll talk about it. Welcome to Sidebar, presented by Law&Crime. I'm Jesse Weber. All right, we have this follow-up to a Sean Diddy Combs story that we at the time really didn't know what to make of it. It kind of came out of left field, but it turns out there is a lot happening here. So this concerns Derrick Lee Cardello-Smith. He is an inmate at Ernest C. Brooks Correctional Facility out in Michigan. He's currently serving up to a 75-year prison sentence for criminal sexual conduct and kidnapping charges. But we aren't really talking about his criminal history so much as we are talking about the fact that he filed a massive lawsuit against Sean Diddy Combs while he's in prison, and now a Michigan court determined he won through a default judgment. And now Sean Diddy Combs is fighting back. There is a lot to get into. I will explain. So, Cardello-Smith claims that Combs drugged and sexually assaulted him at a party in Detroit back in 1997. Cardello-Smith's complaint against Combs states, quote, "I then went to get another drink and Sean asked me if I needed something else. I said no, and he said, 'Here, drink this one.' And I thought it was another glass of Jim Beam, so I took it because I had sat one down in the other room, and then I drank some more, and I stayed sitting there and began getting drowsy and started to pass out. And then Sean Combs said to me, 'I added a little something to it for you. I will get that from you anyway, one way or another.' I then passed out." And then Cardello-Smith claims that when he woke up, Combs allegedly told him that he had assaulted him. Now, Combs didn't use those words, it's more graphic, but essentially he said that he assaulted him while he was unconscious. Cardello-Smith claims that he left, never went back. He alleges he filed a police report, but he couldn't talk about what happened to him. He says that it was therapy in prison that helped him realize he was a victim of rape. And then he alleges that after he files this $100 million lawsuit against Combs, he says recently Combs and or his associates came to the Michigan prison in person to see him and to offer him $2.3 million to dismiss the lawsuit. He claimed Combs said, "You know how we get down," to which Cardello-Smith allegedly responded, "Well, I disagree with how you get down." As we sort through all these legal filings surrounding Sean Combs, can I just take a second to tell you guys about something positive for once, something that I think you're going to really, really love. Would you want cash back when you buy gas and groceries? That's where our amazing partner comes in, our sponsor of Sidebar, Upside. They can help. So this is a free app that is truly so easy to use. Upside gets you real cash back, money that appears in your Upside app that you can transfer straight into your bank account. Just this weekend, I used Upside to find a gas station. I claimed an offer. I pay with my credit card at the pump, and then I followed the steps on the app to get cash back. Truly, it is so simple to use and free, so why not get cash back? And you can use Upside at all different kinds of places, including restaurants and convenience stores. To find out how much you can earn, click the link in the description to download Upside or scan the QR code on screen and use our promo code SIDEBAR and you'll get an extra 25 cents back on every gallon on your first tank of gas. Now, where we last left this off, and this was an interesting turn, is that a Michigan judge had granted Cardello-Smith's petition for a temporary restraining order in order to prevent Combs from selling any real property for a period of 90 days. This was after Combs had listed his LA house for sale. This was during a hearing in August that we covered. And this was a big win for Cardello-Smith, who was representing himself, especially for a guy with a history of being very litigious, filed numerous criminal appeals and civil complaints. I mean, honestly, I was looking at his filings and the terms that he was using. I got to say, for a guy without the resources of a law firm and no proper legal education, it was pretty good. And I mean, it worked. He got the judge to grant the TRO, but it didn't end there. No, because he also asked the court at the time to enter a default judgment against Combs because he claims Combs didn't file an answer to the summons and complaint that he had served upon him. So the judge let him know about next steps, and we looked at the court papers, and included is a signed, sworn declaration from Cardello-Smith that he did serve Combs with this summons and complaint. That'll be important in a minute. Now, a little background here. A default judgment is when the court says, look, you automatically lose this case because you failed to take some sort of action. Now, at the time of the hearing back in August, here's a little bit of the back and forth between the judge and Cardello-Smith.
So you're going to have to file the affidavit and request for default, okay?
Okay. Yes, Your Honor.
And obviously you'll be able to file that before a pretrial date anyway, okay?
Yes, ma'am. Yes, Your Honor. Okay, so
All right,
the order
so
was granted?
The order, your ex parte motion was granted, or your motion for a temporary restraining order was granted. I've signed it. And so we'll get that processed and back to you, and then you'll have to obviously serve that on the parties.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you. Can your order
All right.
say any, Your Honor, can you add on your order any Michigan representatives of him acting on his behalf for Michigan properties as well as part of that order? Or does your order cover everything?
You provided the order, so I'm going off.
Yes,
the
I did.
order.
Yes, I did. Yes, I did.
Yeah, so I'm going off the order you provided to me, and I've signed
Okay,
that order already.
That's what I
Okay.
needed. Thank you. All right.
All
Thank
right,
you, Your
thank
Honor.
you, Mr. Thank you, Mr. Cardello-Smith, and we'll make sure the writ's done, and we'll see you back in September. Thank you.
Thank you. God bless.
And that is exactly what happened. Combs apparently never responded, including to appearing at a virtual court hearing, and the court entered a $100 million default judgment against him. So now he has to pay $10 million a month starting in October. Well, as soon as this became public, you know what happened? Sean Combs responded. So that's what we're going to get into right now. What just happened? Sean Combs' legal team made 2 filings fighting back, and we want to talk about them. The first is Combs' motion to set aside the default judgment. And the reason he says is because he claims he was never served with the summons or complaint, despite what Cardello-Smith says. He claims the first time he ever even learned about this lawsuit was when the media reported about this default judgment and ruled he would owe $100 million. I guess he didn't watch our sidebar on this when we first caught wind of this lawsuit. But anyway, he explains that had he been notified in a timely manner, he would have defended himself. Combs explains that under Michigan law, in order to be served with court papers through certified mail, he has to acknowledge receipt, and a copy of the return receipt has to be signed by him. According to Combs, that didn't happen. He even said that the listed address wasn't his primary current address. And he also says that the dates that Cardello-Smith puts forward, they're all mixed up, which shows that Combs wasn't properly served. So Combs explains that a proof of service that was filed by Cardello-Smith claims that he mailed 1 copy of this pleading on May 31st, 2024. This was 10 days before Cardello-Smith filed the complaint. But Combs says that right there shows Cardello-Smith didn't properly serve him because he was supposed to be served both with a complaint and a court-issued summons. But remember when I said that the dates were mixed up? Combs says that in Cardello-Smith's return of service filing, he says the service was made in July 6, 2021. That was 3 years before filing the complaint. So the dates are all mixed up. But Combs also explains that even if he had been properly served, the default judgment should nonetheless be set aside because he can show good cause for the delay and he has strong defenses to these claims. He says once he found out about the default judgment from the media, he immediately responded. He immediately retained Michigan counsel. He moved to set aside the default judgment 3 days later, and this is where he gets into it. So what are those defenses, right? Well, Combs calls this lawsuit frivolous. He says that the allegations are unbelievable. He actually calls them, quote, made up. And interestingly, in an affidavit from Sean Combs that is attached to his filings, it says, quote, I do not know the plaintiff Derrick Lee Cardello-Smith. I never assaulted the plaintiff. I never paid Detroit police officers or Monroe police officers to keep any assault hidden. I never visited the plaintiff in prison. He claims that Cardello-Smith can't keep his story straight because in his complaint, he claims he was sexually assaulted by Combs after meeting him in a restaurant in Detroit, but then in his pretrial statement, he claims that this happened in Adrian, Michigan. He also calls this allegation of a conspiracy between Combs and high-ranking judicial and law enforcement officials in Wayne County, Michigan, to force Cardello-Smith to sign an agreement to keep silent. He says that this is fantastical. Combs says that Cardello-Smith's narrative is impossible to follow and doesn't explain why, in one instance, Cardello-Smith would have given Combs $150,000 and Combs would have agreed to trade 49% of his net worth over to Cardello-Smith. Combs says Cardello-Smith wants this court to believe that a judge, a sheriff, a police officer all signed handwritten confessions to crimes. He says that this is absolutely absurd, and also is absurd the idea that he visited him in prison. Now, aside from these defenses and saying that this is totally fabricated, Combs also says that even if you take these sexual assault allegations as true, the statute of limitations on these claims ran out, expired 17 years before the lawsuit was filed. So now you might be saying, okay, these are pretty good arguments by Sean Combs, right? You could see how if Combs had responded promptly, he may have been able to assert these defenses and get the case thrown out. But of course the question is, now that a default judgment has been entered, is it too late now? What's the law on this? Well, under Michigan law, a default judgment could be set aside if the court lacks jurisdiction or if you can show good cause and a defense on the merits of the case. Combs claims he meets both criteria. First, Combs claims that the court lacks personal jurisdiction over him. Why? Because he says, as I mentioned before, that he was never properly served the papers. This is a due process requirement. You need to be made aware of allegations against you so you can defend yourself. And Combs cites case law in support of this. For example, he cites an unpublished opinion. By the way, those are court decisions that aren't listed in the official register of cases. They can be cited, but it seems that Michigan courts, like other courts across the country, don't really love you relying on them. Anyway, one decision that Combs relies on here is Jacobs v. George. This is a court of appeals case that held, quote, because defendant did not acknowledge receipt of the registered mail containing the summons and complaint, and the registered mail receipt filed with the circuit court reflected the signature of someone other than the defendant, he was not properly served, and the court abused its discretion by denying defendant's motion for relief from default judgment. So a very similar fact pattern in a way to Sean Combs. Now, in terms of good cause, that portion of the test here, in terms of if you can set the default judgment aside because of good cause, Combs claims he has a reasonable excuse for failing to respond because he wasn't served, and he further states that it would be manifestly unjust to not set aside the default judgment. So two prongs of that good cause test. Combs says he meets both. In terms of meritorious defenses, and that's a reason, again, that the default judgment should be set aside. Now, Combs says that Cardello-Smith, he can't win on the merits of this case, because not only does Combs deny everything and say this is all made up, but the claims, as I mentioned before, he makes the argument are time barred, that the sexual assault claims are from 27 years ago, and under Michigan law, the statute of limitations to bring a lawsuit on such claims is 10 years. He would have had to bring this in by 2007. Also, interestingly, Combs then cites a Michigan Supreme Court case that said courts have to look at several factors for good cause and meritorious defenses in order to set aside a default judgment. And he claims that 5 of the 7 factors weigh in his favor. Number 1, the time period between the entry of the default judgment and a filing of the motion to set it aside. Combs says it was 3 days. Once he found out what was going on, he didn't delay on it, retained counsel. As soon as he found out, he tried to get this default judgment set aside. Number 2, whether there was defective process or notice. We already talked about that there. 3, the circumstances behind the failure to file. Again, Combs claims he had no knowledge of this action. That's why he didn't file a response. 4, whether the failure to file by Sean Combs was knowing or intentional. Combs says this was completely unintentional. 5, the size of the judgments and the amount of costs. Now, this is interesting because Combs says $100 million? That's extraordinary. It is incompatible with any measure of damages, even if Cardello-Smith won this case $100 million, even if these allegations are true, he says it's nonsense. So Sean Combs is looking for an immediate hearing on this issue. He is asking the court to put this default judgment to the side. He is asking for an award of sanctions. He is asking for his attorney's fees to be paid. And if the court should find that Combs has to respond to Cardello-Smith's complaint, then give him 21 days to do it. Now, as I mentioned, that was one filing from Combs. The other is regarding Cardello-Smith filing a motion seeking a TRO, the restraining order, the injunction that stopped Combs from selling the property. I'm going to briefly go over this other filing by Sean Combs, but I want you to listen to this first line in Combs' motion to dissolve the TRO. It says, quote, "This is a frivolous lawsuit against a prominent businessman based on obvious fabrications filed by a convicted rapist and serial litigant with an overactive imagination and a thirst for fame." Wow. Now, in Combs' filing, he again reiterates that he wasn't properly served, that he wasn't aware of this lawsuit, and then he more specifically explains why Cardello-Smith is not entitled to a TRO or an injunction. First, Combs says that Cardello-Smith has failed to identify an immediate and irreparable injury or loss or damage. Second, Combs says he hasn't met the requirement of an injunction because you have to show a likelihood of winning this case on its merits. And as we previously discussed, we know why Combs believes Cardello-Smith can't do that. Also, he says that Cardello-Smith would have to show that he suffered some irreparable harm should the injunction not be granted. But Combs says there is nothing like this here. Cardello-Smith is looking purely for money damages. That's it. Combs cites case law to establish that that is not irreparable harm. You can resolve this in a lawsuit. A TRO or an injunction is about the court stepping in to stop something from happening immediately. There's a sense of urgency there. Otherwise, someone would suffer a tremendous injury if the court didn't jump in. I'll give you an example. If you stop a foreclosure of a home that someone is living in, that you can understand. If you don't do that, there is immediate harm. And finally, Combs says that Cardello-Smith can't prove that an injunction is in the public interest. In fact, he explains that Cardello-Smith didn't even argue that point. So Combs argues that the injunction order is defective, that it violates his constitutional rights of due process, again, since he claims he wasn't made aware of any of this, that the court lacks jurisdiction over him because he wasn't properly served. Also, Combs says that Cardello-Smith has no legal or equitable interest in his real property, in his homes. Cardello-Smith just didn't want the property sold in case he wins a money judgment against Combs. Combs says the law is very clear on this, that equity alone doesn't allow for a pre-judgment injunctive relief to prevent a defendant from selling or transferring assets in which the plaintiff doesn't hold a lien or equitable interest. And Combs cites a Supreme Court case in support of that. So Combs is asking for the court to dissolve the injunction. Now, in totality, what do we make of this? For Combs, this is certainly not what he needed, as he faces multiple lawsuits accusing him of sexual assault, trafficking, violence, illegal weapons, and narcotics possession. All the while, he currently might be the target of a criminal investigation emanating from the Southern District of New York. They might be looking into human trafficking allegations. We know his homes were raided several months ago, although to be clear, we can't confirm that he is the target. We don't know what exactly is happening behind the scenes. There have been no arrests. There have been no charges in connection with that probe. But look, going back to this, the allegations asserted by Cardello-Smith are eerily similar to other allegations that have been made against Combs by other people, including by another man. And we don't know if this is true. We don't know what additional evidence that could be presented to back up these claims. At the very least, the court thought there was enough there to grant the TRO, to grant the default judgment. So he raises a number of strong arguments here, Mr. Combs. And look, courts don't look too kindly on defendants who choose not to respond and they are adverse to reversing a default judgment. But Sean Combs raises a number of strong arguments. We know that Cardello-Smith has been quite litigious. They haven't all been success stories like this for him, so we don't know exactly what to make of the claims. But if there are legitimate reasons for why Combs chose not to respond, and there are significant deficiencies in Cardello-Smith's case, this default judgment and this TRO could very well be reversed. We're going to see what happens out in Michigan. That's all we have for you right now here on Sidebar, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us. And as always, please subscribe on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Jesse Weber. Speak to you next time.